want you to think about your relationships for just a minute today. Just think about your relationships. And as you think about your relationships, I want you to think about who is number one. Who is number one in your relationships? You know, when I first learned to count, my teachers, which in this case was probably my mother started teaching me how to count with the same number that probably your mother taught you how to count, which was the number what? The number one. And ever since then, when we learned to count with the number one, we have wanted to be one. We've wanted to strive to be number one. We wanted to be first. It's like when we were in kindergarten and the teacher said, hey, it's time to line up for recess. And so we would line up to go to lunch or recess, and we line up at the door. It was a mad dash to get to the door because you wanted to get there first. You want to be first in line. If you weren't first in line, you might try to cut and try to get in first in line. Then someone would say, hey, I was here first. It's just how we lived our life. We want to be first chair. We want to be first in the class. We want to be first in the car. I grew up with 3 brothers. There were 4 of us. And as we grew up in the home and Mom said, hey, it was time to leave, we were to go somewhere, it was a mad dash out of the house to get to the car. And of course, as I was the one in the front of the line yelling and running, I was yelling, shotgun, shotgun. Now, I had no idea why I was yelling shotgun, other than that's what people yell who want to be first, who want the best seat, the passenger seat, there in the front. You just yell shotgun. I had no idea it came from the stagecoach days when they're driving those horses and you got some guy with a shotgun next to the driver to fight off the bandits. You know, I didn't know that actually is what that came from, but I was just yelling it because I wanted to be first. It's just how I grew up. We look at kindergartners, we look at kids who yell shotgun, we look at kids who want to be first in their relationships, and we all know that that's not sustainable for the future. You can't want to be first in everything and have healthy relationships. And we chalk it up to immaturity. We look at those kindergartners and think they're just impatient. They want instant gratification. It's just childness. That's why they want to be first. The problem is the very same attitudes that are present in kindergartners often are carried with us all the way into adulthood. And into adulthood, we have the same battle with selfishness, the same battle with self-centeredness. It's just the stakes are higher. Because when you carry it into adulthood, what you see are abuses of power, the using of people, hoarding resources, greed. You see self-centeredness on display. That's what it looks like when people want to be first. Now, I'm not talking about a person's drive or ambition to be the best they can be. I'm not talking negatively about a person's commitment to excel or to lead or to create or to build something significant, a successful business that thrives in our economy. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the person that when it comes to relationships, they look to themselves first. When they start counting the people in the room, and if there's 5 people in the room, they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's kind of a mindset. It's an attitude that's always thinking of themselves. But what we're going to see today is that if you're a Christ follower, if you're a Christian, if you want to grow in spiritual maturity, if you want healthy relationships, you're going to have to learn how to count differently. You don't count 1, 2, 3. There is a number 1, but it's not you. And so if you have your Bible today, I want you to open up to Philippians chapter 2. Maybe you've got your device with you. We're going to continue in this series that Alan started last week from chapter 1. The series is called It's Simple. And it's coming from the book of Philippians. And today I simply want us to think through how to count. How to count. In our text, what we're going to see is that people who want to count themselves first are living in complete opposition to the way that Jesus taught us to count. That people who learn to count correctly, they're in agreement. That in our relationships, it should look like this. Christ is number 1. Others are number 2. I am third. Christ is number 1, others are number 2, I'm third. And Philippians is making it clear. Christ is number 1, He is preeminent. He's above all. He's before all. There's no question he's number one. Alan pointed out last week from chapter 1 as he was reading that text where there were people who were preaching Christ out of selfish ambition, and they were actually making life hard for Paul as he was in prison. And what is Paul's response to that? That life's getting hard for him and they're bringing trouble to him and all this stuff. Paul's response was this from chapter 1, verse 18. He says, the important thing is that in every way Christ is preached. Paul was, look, this isn't about me. In fact, I'm pretty low on the list. I'm third here. People are hearing about Jesus. They're second. And the most important thing is Jesus, that he's preached. That is the most important thing. Christ is number one. He is most important. He has that position. In Philippians 2:9, it's going to say it this way. Jesus has a name that's above every name. He has a name above every name. And it makes it clear who's number one in our relationships. It's not me. It's Christ. So then who's number two? Well, it says here in Philippians 2:3, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more. Count others more significant than yourselves. Count them more significant. Count them before you count you. Consider others. Take an interest in others before you're focused on your own interests. In the practical living out of our Christian life, we need to count others more because that's what Christ did. Jesus, who's number one, he too counted others more. He had a name that was above every name, and yet it was Jesus in the way that he lived his life, in the way that he considered others, in the way that he valued others, in the way that he counted others. He counted them before he counted himself. Verse 21 of chapter 2 says it this way, for everyone looks out for their own interests. Everyone. Everyone in our world is looking out for their own interests. Well, not those of Jesus Christ. Not the believers, not the Christians. Not if you're following Jesus. You count differently. It's not me first, it's me third if you're living for Jesus. And so Christians who say me third, they become a part of a community. They become a part of a church that has a purpose, that has oneness, that has unity. People who aren't saying me first, but are saying me third. When you're in a church like that, you can feel it. A church that says me third, it is that kind of a church where you see people who are not only just loving Jesus, but they're loving one another. They're caring for other people. You want to be a part of a church like that. And so, coming back to our text, here's how Paul says it. He says, therefore, this is chapter 2, beginning in verse 3, Philippians. He says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if you have any comfort from his love, any common sharing in the Spirit, if you have tenderness and compassion, and it kind of sounds when you're reading this text like he's saying, hey, if you do, like, boy, I hope you do, but that's not the tone at all. When Paul writes this text, it's not really, if you have this, he's saying, obviously you have this. Maybe a better word than if would be since. Since you have encouragement from being united with Jesus, since you have comfort, since you're sharing in the Spirit, since you have tenderness and compassion, since you have this, because you have this, then he goes on. Then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. I'm going to pause there for just a minute. Do nothing from a place of selfish ambition or conceit. You know what conceit means? Conceit means empty glory. That's what conceit means. Conceit means that you puff yourself up. You puff yourself up because you care more about you than anybody else. So you want the attention, you want the acclaim, you want the fame. You want to puff yourself up. It'd be kind of like having a balloon representing somebody's life. And if this is your life, people who have conceit are people who they want to puff themselves up. Every breath, everything they do in life, if they can get the advantage, they want to puff themselves up. When they talk about themselves, they want to make sure people realize that they are. And so they talk about them, they share. And pretty soon it's like every breath they live, everything they do is just. Hang on. Sorry. It's kind of hard. Some of you are starting to close your ear. You're plugging your ears, aren't you? I see you plugging your ears. Actually, don't worry. Because eventually, some people, the bubble bursts. And all of a sudden, it all comes crashing down. But that's not usually how it happens. People who are full of conceit, people who have conceit, who puff themselves up, they're full of empty glory. In other words, they stretch the outside so that they look bigger, but on the inside, they're empty, full of hot air. Usually what happens is people who have conceit, they don't just suddenly burst. They normally just... It's like Muhammad Ali whenever he was in the airplane. And, he was the greatest boxer of all time. He was at the height of his career. Muhammad Ali, who was saying, I'm the greatest, and that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, he kind of lived up that he was like one of the best boxers there for a while. But anyway, he was on the plane, and he was sitting in the seat, and the stewardess told Muhammad Ali to fasten his seatbelt. And if you've seen Muhammad Ali, you know how he folded his arms defiantly, and he said, Superman don't need no seatbelt. And she said, Superman don't need no plane. Empty glory. That's what it's like. When we puff ourselves up, pride comes before a fall. And Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition or, because eventually it gets to nothing. But in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Having this in mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by being obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. When you look at Jesus in this text, he didn't do anything out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. In humility, Jesus considered others better than himself. He's the prime example. He's the great example. But Paul doesn't just give us one example. In Philippians 2, he gives us 4. He gives us Christ in verses 1 through 11. And then he gives us Paul himself in verses 12 through 18. We'll hit those verses next week. And then he gives us Timothy in verses 19 through 24. And then he gives us Epaphroditus in verses 25 through 30. 4 examples of people who lived their life not counting the way the world counts, but saying Christ first, God first, the Father first, others second, me third. And the text says that Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. I just want to talk for a minute about what that means, equality with God, something to be grasped. Because when he says that, we're not talking about the person of Jesus. The person of Jesus was equal with God, has been equal with God, will always be equal with God. The person of Jesus is God. He always was, is, and always will be God. So when Jesus came to earth, he didn't set aside his deity. He was completely, fully God. So the person of Jesus being equal with God, that never changed. And so when it says he did not consider equality with God something that had to be attained and held on to, but he made himself nothing, we're not talking about the person, we're talking about his position. Positional equality. Positional equality became different. That meant that Jesus, his positional equality with God the Father in heaven, meant that he was a part of the kingdom of heaven and all comfort and everything that is glorious there in heaven. But that he did not consider that something that he had to hold on to at all costs. But instead, when man sinned, he was willing to let go of his positional equality, and he was willing to humble himself and become obedient to death, even death on a cross, to save mankind. Positionally, he became lower in his circumstances than the Father. Positionally, he came down, which is why in John chapter 14, Jesus would say, "The Father is greater than I." Not in essence, the person of Jesus was still God, but the Father is greater than I because positionally I have lowered myself and humbled myself below the Father. But when Jesus raised from the dead and ascended into heaven and his circumstances was now with the Father again, he was positionally equal with the Father again. In fact, it says that God exalted him to the highest place. No one had a right to be more proud or to hang on to his position in heaven than Jesus. And yet what we see is his attitude when he came to earth was to do the will of his Father first, and then to consider others second and himself third. That means when I have that kind of an attitude, I have it whether those people deserve it or not, whether it's easy or not. In my attitude, I consider you second, I'm third. And that doesn't mean that you have a low view of yourself, or you beat yourself up, or you avoid self-care. I mean, even Jesus went off to pray with his Father, alone, away from the crowds. Even Jesus set priorities. Even Jesus had a mission. And there were people whose missions didn't match the mission the Father had for him. He was still a man on mission. But as he served, he considered others. He loved others. He valued others. I love this poem from Charles D. Meigs that says, "Others, Lord, yes, others. Let this my motto be. Help me to live for others that I might live like thee." Jesus as an example, a perfect example. And you might be inclined today to say, you know, Jesus as an example is too hard to attain. I mean, he was sinless, he was perfect. You know, that's just too hard to live up to. I'm not sure I can do that. Well, he's not the only example. Paul was an example. You're like, yeah, but Paul was like the greatest missionary of all time. I can't live up to that example. Okay. Well, how about Timothy? Timothy was a nobody from nowhere. Or how about Epaphroditus? These guys didn't like perform these great miracles that you just have to be overwhelmed. They were just ordinary guys. And yet they're listed as examples who did this very thing. Like in chapter 2, verses 20 and 21, in regard to Timothy, Paul says, "I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare, for everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ." He's like, man, look at Timothy. This guy shows genuine care for people. When you look at Timothy, he looks like Paul, his mentor, but he also looks like Jesus in the way that he lived. He has a concern for other people. Timothy was able to do this, and not just Timothy, but Epaphroditus in verses 25 and 26. In regard to Epaphroditus, Paul says, "But I think it's necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is so distressed because you heard he was ill." Epaphroditus was the one that was sent to go care for Paul's needs while Paul was in prison, and he brought a monetary offering with him to Rome. He was sent there to care for someone else, to put someone else's needs ahead of his own. And Paul uses him as an example of this. And what we see, the qualities that are exhibited in these men, the examples that have been set for us. If you want to be a church that's one in purpose and is unified and moving forward, then you need to understand this. You need to count others before you count yourself. You need to learn to count the way Jesus did, and the Paul did, and Timothy did, and Epaphroditus did. You need to count others before you count yourself. Let me give you an example of this. In the 1940s, the father of Kennecott, Uncle Bill Lance, was giving a message, and his message was entitled, "I'm Third." And sitting out in the audience that day, listening to that message, was a young boy by the name of Johnny Ferrier. He was 9 years old, and he was listening to Bill Lance give a message about "I'm Third." That motto, God first, others second, I'm third, is the motto of Kennecott Camps. Bill Lance is the father of Kennecott Camps. You know, down here in the Branson area, the Kennecott Camps that have served so many. Well, Johnny grew up. He became a Kennecott counselor. He was a running back at Colorado State University. He joined the Air Force. He flew an F-86 Sabre jet. He flew through the war. He made it back. And when he made it back, he became part of an elite group, a flying force of men, the Minutemen. There were four of the best pilots, and they would do these air shows. And on June 7th, 1958, he was doing an air show. And he was doing one of their favorite maneuvers. It was called the Fleur de Lis, where they would scream over the crowd, thousands of people, wingtip to wingtip. Then they would thrust the jets upward, and they would leave a plume of white smoke behind them. Then they would fan out once they got to the top. Johnny began to fan out. He went to the right like he did. The problem was when he did that, it was obvious that there was a problem with his plane. The rear rudder locked into place. His plane began to roll. He began to go into a dive. He was in trouble. He had both hands on the stick trying to get control, and his plane was headed towards some houses. 3 times the commander commanded him to bail out, bail out. John Ferrier couldn't reach the control button to talk because he had 2 hands on a control stick, but what he did instead is he let out, every time he received a command, a plume of smoke to say, I hear you, but I'm a little preoccupied, and I'm not bailing out. And the reason he wasn't bailing out is because he didn't want to go into those homes. One lady who was in one of those homes in a picture window says as the jet was screaming down, she literally could see him in the cockpit, locking eyes with him. And he was trying to steer that aircraft away from those homes, and he successfully did. It landed in a garden between these 4 houses. This was like the only place you could land a plane without killing somebody else. And his life was instantly taken. The force of the impact, people that were nearby flew them backwards, but nobody else was killed in that accident. And he kept his hand on that stick, and he gave his life for others, because to his very death, not just when he was 9, and just not when he joined the Air Force, but to his very last act that he lived in such a way that said, God first, others second, I'm third. And you look at a text like Philippians 2, and you look at someone like Jesus, who did the very same thing to his final breath as he hung on a cross, demonstrating it's not about me. It's my Father's will. And it's about saving those who are doing this to me. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. He was considering others even when they weren't worthy of consideration. Christ did it. Paul did it. Timothy did it. Epaphroditus did it. Johnny Ferrier did it. And you can do it. Count others before you count yourself. When people do that, it's inspiring. It's encouraging. You want to be a part of that. Don't just count others. Don't just consider others, but serve others. Serve others before you serve yourself. Philippians 2, this theme that just comes out significantly is this theme of service. That we count others more than we count ourselves, and we serve others before we serve ourselves. In verse 7, it says, He took on the nature of a servant. It meant he didn't just serve, he identified as a servant. He was the only person in the world who had the right to be served, but he chose not to be. He chose to serve and called us to do the same. Timothy followed that example. It tells us right here in verses 22 through 23, but you know that Timothy has proved himself because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things go with me. Paul says about Timothy, he served with me. In fact, if you're taking notes, maybe you're highlighting something, I would underline that. He served with me. He served with me. There is something powerful when you serve with. People who have to serve by themselves struggle. That's why churches that are really struggling oftentimes have people who are serving by themselves. They're not serving with. That's where Paul found his energy and his joy and strength from serving with somebody. But oftentimes they serve alone or they serve by themselves because no one else will do it. That's why churches that are thriving and healthy and growing, they have people who serve with each other. Nobody's just taking a free ride. They're serving with each other, and it's encouraging. It's invigorating. You see smiles on their faces. You see stuff happening that would never happen otherwise. You see work getting done that would never get done otherwise. It's why all the time here at Northside, at any moment when someone comes into our church, we have opportunities for service. There's some roles that you can't just walk into day one, but there's tons of roles where you can begin to serve in all kinds of different ways. We give those opportunities. That's why when you go to the Next Steps wall in the lobby, there's always, every single week, contribute to ministry cards where you can find ways where you can serve with other people and alongside other people. That's why when you go to Decision Point, we got contribute to ministry cards right there where you can express an interest to talk to someone about getting involved in a deeper way. That's why on your connection card in your bulletin, right there you can write in, I'm interested in talking about ministry and talking to someone about that, because when we serve with, when we just find some way that we can use our gifts and use our abilities and our time and our talent and our treasure for the Lord. Just when we do that and serve with somebody, people are encouraged. The body of Christ grows. It's the attitude that says, when I come here, I'm going to count others before I count myself. I'm going to serve others before I serve myself. That is the kind of church you want to belong to. Because when you serve with people, it's so much funner. Is that grammatically correct? I don't know. It's like this week we were packaging up stuff for the backpack deal, and we had tons of people here working, so I kind of stayed out of the way from that because they had plenty of help. And it was a blast seeing people do that and put it all together. And then I came out and we prayed over that. We prayed for the teachers at Robertson and the families and everybody before we sent the backpacks that way in a shuttle. We were loading a shuttle. Well, when I was done with that, I was kind of helping just carry some of the boxes out to the shuttle and load it in. So Joe Bob and I, we both picked up a box, and when we got out under the canopy, all of a sudden there was these other set of hands, here they are, that began to help us carry the box. It was adorable. This is Evan Medlin right there. He's 3 years old. And we were going out the door carrying this. And the reason he and I did it is because it was so heavy. He and Faith were struggling. So we were like, oh, that's a pretty heavy box. And so we're carrying this thing. And all of a sudden, here came in 2 hands on there. I don't know if he was actually, helping lift the weight or not. I'm not sure. But it was a whole lot more fun when he joined us. And so we're waiting to load the box in while some other boxes are in there. And he was just helping us out, waiting there with us, serving with. Seeing Carter Owens, Aaron and Tracy Owens' little boy, man, he was stuffing those things. And later I'm just thinking, man, watching mom and dad serve, and he's growing a heart for service, and they want to contribute. This is what the body of Christ was meant to do. Every time you walk into a church, think, how can I serve others before you think about how you can serve yourself? And then there's Epaphroditus. Verse 27 through 30, it says, indeed, he was ill and almost died, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I'm all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. So then, welcome him in the Lord with great joy, and honor people like him. I want you to hear that. Honor people like him. Because he almost died for the work of Christ. He risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. When you look at Epaphroditus, he comes to care for Paul. He leaves the comforts of his home. He then has to deal with his own sickness from which he almost died. And Paul says, people like that who care for other people, you need to honor them. He tells the church, honor people who do this well. I know sometimes we don't want to take credit and be called out, things like that. But I thought, we probably need to do better at that as a church. To honor people who do this well. I know a couple of weeks ago we were able to do that for Joe Bob and Faith, and talk about their ministries, not just within the walls of the church, but outside the walls of the church. And it was a blast, and they were surprised. They didn't know. And we had fun doing it. But every week, every single week, there are people that should be honored just for the ministry they do. And I just began thinking about, man, maybe this is something we need to talk more about. Maybe we need to honor Andrew and Christy, who serve in significant ways and leave family and friends and comforts of here to go there. We need to honor people like this morning. I was talking to Bill Parker, he was an elder in our church and led our global outreach team for years, and he and Grace moved away. They've just recently moved back, and they're kind of back at Northside. Grace's sister just passed away this week, and so they were at a funeral this week. And people like Bill should be honored for those years of service and what they do even now to contribute to the church. I was thinking, but following Bill, there was also Patricia Mann, and Patricia Mann served our church faithfully in missions, wanting to expand the missions here at Northside. And following Patricia was Vicki Stevenson, who expanded our missions, our global outreach here at Northside for so long, having a heart for that, and recently has stepped out of that role. Those kinds of things, we ought to honor and celebrate that and thank God for that. We should honor leaders like that. When I look at what happens in our church on a weekly basis, we should honor. This week, I know right now, I'm going to see people, they're going to wash baptism clothes. They're going to be preparing communion. They're going to be running the cameras. They're going to be prepping funeral meals. We've had way too many of those lately. They're going to be teaching preschoolers about Jesus, happening right now. They're going to brew the coffee and be hospitable so that when people come in, they feel welcomed and comfortable and they want to do this. Youth leaders are going to be praying with students and huddling up in their circles and facilitating a time of prayer and learning their names so that they feel valued and loved. They're going to serve others before they serve themselves. They're going to count others before they count themselves. That's what people in great churches do. They take on that attitude that Jesus has, and Paul had, and Epaphroditus had, and Timothy had, and Johnny had, and that you are going to have. You care for people's needs. You care for people when they're hurting. Okay, if we're telling stories, I'm grateful that Emily Ackridge did what nobody would want to do when your heart's breaking for someone else. But, a young couple in our church this week, she was 2 weeks away from delivering her baby when one day there was no heartbeat. Her baby died. We had a funeral yesterday for an infant. And Emily Ackridge, she was there at the hospital. She raced there to be with that couple, to love on them, to care for them, to sit with her at a funeral that just is not right. There's nothing about that feels right. Offering love, support, people providing food. Our church called because there were some people in our church that wanted to help cover the cost of the funeral. And I called Judy at the funeral home to tell her that. She's like, other friends have already taken care of it. It's already been paid. It's people loving people, serving, considering them before themselves. You don't just serve, but you identify as a servant. George MacDonald says, you can tell whether or not you're becoming a servant by how you act when people treat you like one. How did Jesus act when people treated him like a servant? Well, the gospel, through the eyes of Philippians 2, talks about humility, not considering his own needs, but those of others. From a cross he would hang and say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You read Philippians 2, this text we're reading about Jesus coming to earth. And if you ever feel like no one in the world loves you, then read this passage because you'll find out someone does. If you've ever felt like God just doesn't care and he's off running some distant galaxy, then memorize Philippians 2 and you'll find out he's a lot closer than you think. And if you think the God of the universe is so impressed with himself so much that he would never associate with a commoner like you, then read Philippians 2. And you'll find out he became a man. He was treated like a common criminal. He was ridiculed and beaten and stripped of his clothing. He was nailed to a cross and he was jeered and mocked in front of the bystanders. But he came to serve you, to love you, to give his life for you. He didn't come for the healthy. He came for the sick. That was you. He didn't come for the righteous. He came for sinners. That was you. He served you with his very last breath. It is Jesus who brings peace. It's Jesus who calms the rage in our hearts. It's Jesus who overcomes Satan, the evil one, death, and the grave. It is Jesus who conquers all. It's Jesus that helps us overcome our fears. It is Jesus and only Jesus. And he is an example that we want to follow, to be like that, to serve like that, to count others like that. So that when you, here in just a moment, in fact, I'm going to ask that our servers go ahead and be dismissed for communion. So that in just a moment, when we take bread representing the body of Jesus broken for us and a cup representing the blood of Jesus that was shed for us, we will in that moment be able to connect the dots and say, he did not count himself when he did this. He did not serve himself when he did this. And may we share his attitude. And so Jesus, as we partake this morning, as we're ready, as we remember what you did for us and the perfect example you set for us, Lord, I pray that our hearts would be surrendered to your heart, our wills to your will, that, Lord, we would look like you. Jesus, you are everything. Your name is above every name. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.